A warning to our listeners. Violence and sex are discussed in this episode. Previously on Case Unsolved.
Everybody's carrying around some kind of stereotype, some kind of shorthand of what someone charged with these kinds of offenses, a sex worker, is like.
She didn't dress like a hooker. She was very conservative.
A woman would never know when she got into a car whether it would be somebody who treated her relatively well or somebody who was violent.
One day she took off, and it was in the evening, and she never came back.
I'm Carlos Virgen from The Day in New London, Connecticut. On Case Unsolved, we tell the stories of unsolved murders and the people, family, friends, and law enforcement who are left without resolution. This is part 2 of the Desiree Michaud story. Up to this point, we know that Desiree was born in Plainfield, was sexually assaulted as a child, showed promise as an artist, but ended up working as a prostitute in New London, where she was last seen on Bank Street by Cindy Griffin, who was working as a prostitute at the time.
I saw her probably a half hour. She made a date before I did, so I was still walking around, and I'm saying to myself, I wonder how she made out. She'll be back, because we always met up at the hygienic. She never came back. And I went home thinking about it, and I said, maybe she hit the jackpot and, didn't have to come out anymore.
Desiree Michaud, white female. According to the death certificate, she was a student at New London High School. And the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation. Date of death was April 7th, 1984.
Matt Morton, one of 2 retired detectives who spoke with the Day's courts reporter, Karen Florin.
This was by the Chief Medical Examiner in Farmington, Connecticut, Catherine Galvin, MD.
Mike Lewin and Matt Morton were both people that I had met very early in my career as when they were with the Groton Town Police. And so when I read some articles indicating they'd been involved in this case, I gave them a call.
I was home. My wife and I had gone out to dinner at China Village in Westerly.
Mike Lewin almost immediately agreed to come on in.
So we were in bed, and I had a rotary phone, and the phone rang early in the morning. He says, "Hey, Mike, you got to get up to the flagship. They've got something going on. They're calling in everybody, from the chief down."
The Flagship Motel, now known as the Flagship Inn and Suites, is located across the river in Groton and was well known to the Groton Town Police.
At the time, I believe it was the cheapest hotel around. And I'm not saying it was loaded with prostitutes, but we were there a lot. A lot of times in those cheaper places, people tend to sneak out, or they take a TV, or, I'm not saying we dealt with them on a daily basis, but we certainly knew the clerks. They were always prime targets to be robbed.
See, I arrived at 4:56.
Matt Morton, he also said he would come in, and we got pretty excited when he said he still had his files.
So I had been called at home. And already at the scene were Captain Vance Lamb, Detective Peter Hall, Detective John Graves, Officer Mike Lewin, Sergeant Walter Conley, Lieutenant David Vaness.
Walt Conley was the midnight street sergeant, and he had been a detective for a long time. He says, "Yeah, we got a call. We thought it was a medical call." And the 2 officers that went up there was Jeff Mutart and Steve Thompson. And they went in, they said, "This is a medical." And so we know we had a homicide on our hands.
Matt Morton, who had made it all the way to captain, was a meticulous record keeper. He actually made a drawing of the crime scene, and he showed us that.
She was laying on the bed. naked. There was a cord around her neck. There were clothes on the floor. There was a towel on the floor. There was a knife laying on the floor in front of one of the stands.
And it was a typical motel room that somebody was living in. It wasn't, I'm spending the night and then going over to the seaport, or I'm spending the night and going down and see a launching of a sub. It was well lived in, you know, clothes all over, fast food wrappers everywhere.
There was stuff, pile of clothes on the floor. There was a towel here. Right? Everything else was neat. There was nothing knocked over. I believe this was a radio, though, with the cord ripped around her neck. Looked like there was I don't know if it was minor or what, stab or puncture wound on her chest. But that apparently that was not the cause of death.
Again, it was a weekend, so the motel was pretty full, if not, you know, the no vacancy sign might have been out. You know, they had to get people up. People were leaving, were trying to grab them. One of the auxiliary officers was there, Bobby Bajork, and had him grab all the license plates in the parking lot. You got to get a hold of cab companies. We interviewed a lot of people.
Okay, here's Kathleen Stanley was the woman that worked in the office. Says everything was quiet until about 1 a.m. At that time, she received a call from room 113. The occupant said she couldn't get any sleep, that there was a lot of angry voices coming from the room next door. She wasn't sure, but thought it was room 114. The clerk called the room and got no answer.
It was Detective Morton who took a woman who had been staying in a neighboring room for hypnosis.
10. Relax a little more now.
We didn't have access to the recording of the hypnosis.
9, 8.
But Matt Morton allowed us to read aloud from his copy of the transcript during our recorded interview.
7, 6, 5, 4.
We then asked 2 actors to come in and dramatize what we read from the transcript.
3, 2, 1. Describe what's happening now.
It was very interesting. I had my doubts initially, but listening to the hypnotist and the woman witness, it was, like I say, it was very interesting, and you know, I'd believe in it.
I kind of hear voices in the room. There's an argument, a man, and I think another man. No, it's a man and a woman. I don't know if there's 2 men, but it's definitely now a man and a woman. I didn't hear her voice before.
The woman appears to have been staying there and hearing all kinds of commotion in neighboring rooms as she was trying to go to sleep.
She's shouting at him.
She's shouting at him.
Uh-huh. She's shouting at him. He isn't shouting at her.
What is she saying?
I don't know.
Can you describe her shout?
She's mad. She's real mad.
It's not like, you know, the woman lays down and he does the chain in front of her face. He talked very slowly, very monotone, just put her in a relaxing mood.
Can you tell what she's angry about?
No. Her voice gets higher pitched and she's getting madder. I can't remember. I hear her scream. But she's not screaming a long scream. It's a short scream, like she's afraid.
She's afraid.
Uh-huh.
How do you know she's afraid?
By the way she screams. It isn't a surprise scream. She's afraid. I hear some more thumps. And I got up and called because I thought something bad was going on in there. I got worried.
Who answered the phone?
I don't know.
What did you tell them?
That something was going on next door. Violent. And that I was scared. I was worried.
It wasn't exact information. She didn't say, You know, I saw, I can describe this person this way, I can do this, but the information she gave was more than she initially could remember, and it did help us in some of our follow-ups.
She said, "All right, thank you. I'll take care of it." And I hung up. And I stood there with my hand on the phone. And I could hear the phone ring, okay? In that room. And I thought, I must have been wrong. It must have been like between a husband and wife. When the phone rang, it was like quiet then.
I think she may have described the moment that Desiree was killed.
Just kind of relax, and I'm going to take you a little deeper now. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. Just picture yourself lying there in the bed. And when I get to 1, just kind of think about this thumping sound that you hear.
She talks about an argument with a woman and a man, and you get the feeling that she actually heard the argument that preceded the murder.
I snuggled down. I'm so tired. And I hear these bangings.
Describe the sound.
It's loud. And there's a lot of it. It's more than once. It sounds like something's being thrown. Sounds like a body being thrown, as opposed to an object. Not a body, but a person. Because an object has a hollow sound, and a body makes a bump.
We used every tool we could think of to try to get information, and this was just one tool. Not to say that we couldn't use it in the future if something like this happened. I don't see it's just another investigative tool for us to use.
And you know, once you get into that investigation like that at that end, every prostitute has someone that has abused her, beaten her up, maybe choked her, you know. So, you know, we were getting all sorts of names, and not just people from the one in Groton, but all over. I had gone down to New York City to interview a guy. Some of the other guys had gone up, I think it was Albany or Syracuse or something, to interview people. You know, we went all over.
Theory was one of the Johns got into an argument with her over money. That was one theory. Another theory was maybe one of her boyfriends got upset, got into an argument because she was holding money or not, you know, not giving him anything. We're not sure, but like I said, based on what she did, it could have been, you know, any kind of an argument. And listening to that woman who was hypnotized describing an argument, that's what we assume. Either it was over the sex or it was over the payment.
I think she went with one of her jobs
Again, Cindy Griffin.
because she seemed secure with it, and she seemed like it was, I think it was someone she had been with before and knew her. And because she used to always go to the motel. She called him, he's a friend, she said. I'm waiting for friends to go on, said I'll catch up with you when I get back.
From the day's reporting in 1984, we know that Desiree left New London sometime before midnight. The phone call from room 113 to the motel's front desk happened around 1 a.m. Groton police were called at 3:52 a.m.
We learned that Desiree had a boyfriend and perhaps / pimp. I think when we asked police, was he one or the other, they say, no, he was really both. His name was George Harris. He was also known as Angel. During our reporting, we learned that George was the person who found Desiree in the motel room, notified the front desk who called the police. So he was there when police arrived at the crime scene.
One of the first things I did was we contacted the state police. and got a polygraph operator up. And at the time, all the state police polygraphs were given at the old boys training school up in Meriden. So I drove her boyfriend up there to take a polygraph. So that was all night, most of the next day. He was upset. I mean, he wasn't, sitting in a chair crying, but you could tell he was upset.
Nobody has ever come right out and said to us, he passed the polygraph, but it appears that that's what's happened.
I brought him back to the station, interviewed him some more. Some of the other detectives interviewed him. We took a statement from him, and he was free to go.
In the days and weeks and perhaps months after her death, he appears to have been somewhat cooperative with police. So I would guess that as the case was investigated and then reopened, he had a lot of knocks on his doors. George, we're here to talk about Desiree. So I suppose I'm not that surprised that when we knocked on his door, he didn't want to talk to us. Hey, how you doing? We're looking for a guy named Angel.
Angel?
Yeah, number 4. What number are you?
This ain't Angel's house. I don't know. Where you live at?
We tracked him down in that strange way that you do now through social media and online and websites and news stories. And one day went to find him. We knocked on the door, nobody answered. We went next door, and a man that I recognized as his son answered the door. Hey, George. Hello? In the meantime, I had already sent the son a note, via Facebook Messenger saying, hey, can you tell your father we want to talk to him?
I got your Facebook message.
I thought so.
To him, but he was reluctant.
And the son said, my dad, I relayed the message. He doesn't want to talk about this. And that was sort of the end of our reporting on George Harris.
In addition to Harris, police also talked to a man everyone referred to as Cowboy. He had been seen in the area around the motel the night of the murder, and an artist's rendering of the cowboy hat-wearing man was published in the Day. Detective Lewin suspected someone else, who he wouldn't identify, but said that other detectives didn't agree. Some serial killers were active in the region at the time, and there were others who were charged with assaulting or killing prostitutes. But for various reasons, MO, location, etc., they were not pursued as suspects.
It's true with that TV show 48 Hours. You want to get some leads really quick, but, sometimes it doesn't work. You got to remember, there was no DNA. We solved most crimes with confessions or fingerprints.
The forensics that are available now would not have been available then, such as I think DNA might have been in its very, very infancy at that point. But because of the nature of her profession, even if somebody's DNA was found in her, for example, during a, like a vaginal swab or something like that, even if the DNA was found, that person might have had sex that night with her, but she was a prostitute.
Her boyfriend was there. There were other people there that we were interviewed, and if we took the fingerprints and compared them, they would probably find their fingerprints somewhere in that room, whether or not they were involved, because she was there for a while. For a couple of days, I was told. And that's why, even if they found fingerprints there, it could have been from days before. Or it could be people that had that room before, who knows?
We would go talk to somebody who had been a client of hers. And so, then they would all have alibis for that night. I mean, we interviewed, hundreds. She was very popular at what she did.
Personally, I think because of the transient population that was involved in the prostitution down on Bank Street. The girls, you got a lot of sailors, you got a lot of people from Electric Boat and Pfizer that were here for short periods of time, temporary duty or whatever, and then they'd go. So it was very difficult.
And we're dealing with so-called witnesses that were, involved in illicit drugs and narcotics and larcenies.
I myself, as you can see, I have a folder here that's thick with interviews that I've done, as part of this investigation. We interviewed, myself, probably about 30 to 50 people myself. And I was just one of maybe a half a dozen detectives from my department that were investigating.
We're dealing with, which everybody had to do then, but with paper records. And remember, we're typing everything that somebody's telling us. I mean, physically typing. And I was the junior guy. I had a manual typewriter. Matt Morton had an electric one with an electric eraser on it.
We had joint meetings, but not everybody was forthcoming with all their investigations. So and that sort of hampered some of us, because some of the detectives or officers that were investigating wanted to solve it themselves, so they kept some of the information from others. And sometimes, when you think you're close to something, it's like, I want to solve this. So okay, I won't say everything that I know, and I'll see if I can do it. And over time, sometimes initially you don't say anything, and then you forget that you didn't say anything. So, several weeks or a month later, it's like, I thought I put that in a report, and somehow it slipped. And maybe it was a piece that we could have all, ran with. I don't know. But that's the way it was way back then. Since then, it's changed considerably. And even after that, because we all learned, after time went by and it wasn't solved, we all learned that, hey, maybe we should have been more forthcoming with everything we had right from the beginning, rather than trying to wait and be the hero.
So they're older men, and they've been thinking about this. They retired without being able to solve these cases or to see them resolved. So they both said that, they weren't as dramatic as to say they've been haunted by them, but they both said they would love to see them solved. They had unfinished business because they hadn't been able to solve them.
And our department really wanted to solve this. And I know the women who worked on it did. Were some places, well, she's just a prostitute, geez, what are you doing spending all that time? Well, young person like that, who knows what she could have done with her life.
It's always stayed with me, right on through all the different ranks that I held and all the different jobs that I did at the police department.
And particularly Matt Morton, he brought this file home with him after he retired.
This case always interested me because as a detective, this is my first major case. So naturally I kept it, I kept my reports, my copies, hoping that one day it would be solved.
It meant that much to him that he wanted to keep the details of the case close to him, just in case something came up or he had a thought.
And I'm sure that they're not going to be happy that, I'm talking somewhat about it.
It was almost like he was urging his fellow police, fellow investigators to cut loose with some information get this out there in as much detail as possible because it's been so long.
I mean, it's not like this happened even 5 years ago. I mean, this is 1984, 30 some years ago. Let's close this case. That's what I want. And whatever it takes.
If you have a tip about Desiree Michaud's murder, please contact the Groton Town Police at 860-441-6716 or the New London State's Attorney's Office at 860-443-2835. In next week's final part of Desiree Michaud's story, we discover that Desiree was not forgotten after all.
It was a sort of sense of dashed hopes.
As we find out how her murder affected the New London's arts community.
We pay attention to these tragedies when somebody has been hurt, okay? But we really don't pay much attention about the conditions of lives of a lot of people.
And we find her final resting spot. If you have any comment about our podcast series, please email us at caseunsolved@theday.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Case Unsolved on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to rate the show. If you'd like to join the discussion about the podcast and to get previews and a behind-the-scenes look at the series, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Case Unsolved. Case Unsolved is produced by Peter Wappy and me, Carlos Virgen. Reporting was done by Karen Florin. Editing and audio mixing by Peter Wappy. Tim Cotter is executive producer, and Sassy Larinetta is associate producer. I produce the music used in the series. Voice actors for the dramatization of the Hypnosis session were Eric Michaeline and Suzanne McCormick. This has been a production of The Day in New London, Connecticut.